I know you heard this 100 times already, but I also really want to thank ICT and Professor Boascanor for inviting me here to speak today. And as Ilana told you, I graduated here 2 years ago, so this really feels like coming home. It's great to see a lot of friends here over the last couple of days. And I'm always saying that pursuing my MA degree at IDC Herzliya was the second best decision in my life. The best decision was to marry my wife. She's not sitting in the audience, but she might still be listening in, so you never know. Anyway, fast forward a couple of years. As Ilan told you, I'm now teaching and researching military strategy at the Swiss Armed Forces Military Academy. For those of you who don't know, just like Israel, military service in Switzerland is mandatory, at least for all the young men. It might become mandatory for Swiss young women as well in the future, we'll see. And the military academy's mission is to educate and train the next generation of career officers of our armed forces. So I really love my job, I gotta say. Anyway, talking about, speaking of that, I also have to put up this disclaimer. I mean, it's obviously stating the obvious. I'm here representing the military academy, but everything I'm saying is like strictly personal. So don't call my boss and tell him, hey, what are you guys thinking about Iran? Just what I'm thinking about Iran. Okay, so let's get started. So as somebody who spent the last couple of years intensely studying proxy relationships, I have to say I was really thrilled about the last couple of days because I lost count at how many times people were actually talking about proxies. At the same time, I also suspect that if you would ask all these people what they actually think what proxies or proxy relationships are, it will get very broad and in many ways contradicting a range of answers. You know, this is the I know it when I see it approach. So what I'm going to try to do in this short presentation is to try to think a little bit more systematically about what we're talking about when we're talking about proxy relationships, and then applying it to Iran and what Iran has been doing in the Middle East over the last couple of years or even decades. Finally, I want to discuss, well, we'll see whether there's some time, some of the challenges and issues that the Iranian proxy strategy is facing. All right. So what do we mean when we're talking about proxies? As Asaf Moghadam and I argue in a forthcoming article, it's probably going to be out in next spring, proxy relationships are, and I quote, informal collaborative arrangements between asymmetrically capable parties in which one party, the sponsor, utilizes another party, a proxy, to reach its strategic goals for tangible assistance, blah, blah, blah. If you think that this sounds like a bunch of academic mumbo-jumbo, I'm not blaming you, but it will be published in an academic paper, so that's that. So let's try to unpack this for a second. So first of all, I believe that it's critical to look at proxy relationships through the framework of cooperation. This means that both the proxy and the sponsor decide to collaborate with each other because they believe it will be mutually beneficial for them. However, there are some specifics to this type of cooperation. On the one hand, compared to classic interstate alliances, which, in the field of international security and strategic studies is still considered the gold standard of security cooperation, they are much less formal, meaning that they're usually not codified in an official document that, would include all the conditions and contingencies that these arrangements will be based upon. On the other hand, and if you look at the other end of the spectrum of, you might want to call security cooperation, proxy relationships also differ from cooperation among other militant actors, such as terrorist groups or insurgents, that they are by definition asymmetric. So of course, cooperation among terrorist groups can be asymmetric as well, but I think when we talk about proxy relationships, we would have to call this, or at least political scientists will call this, a necessary condition, but also not a sufficient condition. So all of this, by the way, this is really fairly established among scholars of proxy relationships, but I think Asaf and I, we're taking kind of the next step by, first of all, incorporating more like a broader actor spectrum in our analysis, and we also argued that there's a variation in how state sponsors utilize proxies as opposed to non-state sponsors. But I hope that most of you guys were listening to Asaf on Monday afternoon, so I'm not going to rehash what he was talking about already. Okay, so since we're talking about Iran, I want to quickly point out what, in my opinion, are some of the main benefits for state sponsors. So first of all, okay, well, it's two at the same time, doesn't matter. So first of all, proxy relationships allow plausible deniability. Now, Daniel Byman, who also has studied these issues for a couple of years, has pointed out that very often this so-called plausible deniability is no more than a convenient fiction, but nonetheless it's very effective. And I think this is for one reason, because it works both ways. This means on the one hand, plausible deniability allows a sponsor to claim that he has no knowledge and he bears no responsibility for its proxy's actions. But maybe even more importantly, it also gives the party that is being attacked by this proxy the opportunity, to feign ignorance about the role of the sponsor. And it can forego retaliation or even forego taking any kind of action against the sponsor if he thinks, if this state or this non-state actor thinks that this doesn't really fit its policy choices at the moment. I think the other major benefit of using a proxy strategy is cost effectiveness. Because, as you all know, waging war is extremely costly. I'm not talking only about the direct cost of military operations, but there are also indirect costs, such as domestic audience costs. If you wage war, you might lose the next election, or you might win it, I don't know. There's the issue of political exposure and even international penalties for military aggression. Saddam Hussein learned this lesson in the beginning of the 1990s. So, for the downside of using proxies, there's also a couple of issues. First of all, you have the diverging preferences between the sponsor and the proxy. It means that the proxy might actually decide to divert resources, use it in a way that they weren't intended. It might decide to, provide a suboptimal effort and act in ways that really weren't what the sponsor had in mind. And it might even turn on its sponsor. It all happened in the past. Also, by default, I think using a proxy means that you, especially now, speaking from a state's perspective, you kind of surrender control over some of your foreign policy choices to an actor that is in some ways unpredictable. And the choices that this proxy is gonna, this proxy takes can considerably influence the choices that a state has to make later on. And the proxy's action and even its mere existence can cause a lot of tensions. And we clearly see this in Syria, for example, with the US supporting the Syrian Democratic Forces, which causes, a lot of tensions between Ankara and Washington. Okay. So now if you look at the history of what I would call the Iranian proxy strategy in the Middle East, I think there's some pattern over the past decades that we can discern. I think first of all, there has been a shift from revolutionary zeal to a realpolitik, as we call it in German. I think what it means is that, in the immediate years after 1979, Iran really wanted to export its revolution, and it was really looking to overthrow other governments in countries such as Lebanon, Iraq, or also some of the Gulf states. It set up proxies such as the Supreme Council for the Islamic Revolution in Iraq. I think its title says everything, and of course Hezbollah, its most successful creation to date. However, I think, especially following the Iran-Iraq war, Iran has certainly tempered down some of these revolutionary aspirations. And if you, for example, look at what Iran has been doing post the invasion of Iraq in 2003, I don't think they were really looking into violently take over all of Iraq. I mean, to be fair, at least they didn't have to overthrow the Iraqi government at that time because somebody else had already taken care of that. Second, I think the Iranian approach has also become more gradual and pragmatic. What I mean by that is the following. So first of all, Iran has also started to sponsor groups that are not necessarily subscribing to the Iranian doctrine of, the Iranian revolutionary leader being Prophet Muhammad's deputy on earth, or that aren't even Shia. And of course, I'm talking here about Palestinian groups like the Palestinian Islamic Jihad or the Hamas that are Sunni, and nonetheless have benefited from Iranian money. I'm not saying that the end is necessarily pragmatic, but at least the approach that the Iranians chose is to some degree pragmatic. And as for the gradual approach, I think we can see this in Yemen, for example, where Iran didn't go all in at the first opportunity, but they start to cautiously build up support for the Houthi. And when the situation started to look more promising, they gradually increased their support to the Houthi. So the third pattern, and I think that the main reason that I think Dr. Jones already referred to this, is the main reason for Iran to actually choose such an approach, a proxy strategy, is sheer necessity. Because simply the conventional Iranian military capabilities aren't very impressive. And if Tehran wants to challenge what it considers its regional or global enemies, it has no other option but to rely on proxy forces. And maybe, I don't know, during the discussion we might also be able to talk about whether we should consider them proxies or partner forces. I think, we can have the discussion maybe later. So, what are the goals of the Iranian strategy? I think there's also two main motives. First of all, it is deterrence. Iran uses proxies to deter its adversaries from attacking it directly. But second, and I think this is just as important, Iran also uses its proxy strategy to project power. As I said before, they don't have other options to do that, or very little other options. So to project power and to maintain, expand its influence across the region. So now I want to assess a little bit how Iran has actually fared so far with the strategy over the last couple of years. For simplicity's sake, I'm distinguishing between the military and the political level. My boss wouldn't be very happy about it because he would say I need to distinguish between the tactical, the operational, the strategic level, but for simplicity's sake and because we don't have a lot of time, I'm going to just keep it like that. So on the positive side, and I mean positive side from the Iranian perspective, it has managed to avoid direct retaliation. And again, let me go back to this issue of plausible deniability that I mentioned before. Everybody, and I really mean everybody, knows that Iran is directly responsible for the deaths of countless coalition soldiers during the occupation in Iraq. Yet it has never suffered any kind of direct military retaliation by coalition forces. I'm not going to, speculate on the reasons why this was the case. Another positive outcome for Iran that is certainly gained, both the Revolutionary Guards, the IRGC Quds Force, as well as its proxies, have gained a lot of operational experience, especially over the last 5 years, and it will make them more dangerous in the future. I think just one example, but this is particularly poignant, is I saw some reports about joint operations between Hezbollah and Russian special forces, including Russian air support. And I think this is extremely dangerous, and this will extremely increase Hezbollah's already pretty formidable capabilities. Of course, the Iranian proxy strategy also helped to avert the fall of the Assad regime, at least in part. Obviously, the main reason was the Russian intervention in 2015, but still this was a positive outcome for the Iranians. Politically speaking, Iran has managed to increase its influence in a number of countries, although I wouldn't include Syria in that. I think in Syria they actually lost some of the influence because it's really now Moscow calling the shots. And of course, the rise of the Islamic State even gave Iran a somewhat legitimate cause to utilize some of its proxy forces, namely to fight the Takfiri jihadi groups, or at least that's what Tehran claims what they are doing in the region. Could also talk about this later. On the negative side, Iran obviously doesn't control its proxy groups entirely, and they might not always, share the exact same preferences. And I think the Lebanon War of 2006 is a very good example for that. I think Iran wasn't really interested in having Hezbollah fighting this war, and they did it nonetheless. Obviously, Israel's choices also played some kind of role in that. And there were also some reports about, bickering within Syria between Syrian forces, between Iranian forces and pro-Iranian militias. Another major issue for Iran on the military level is that it really can protect its proxies if some of their targets would decide to retaliate massively. This is mostly due to the fact that the Iranian aerial capabilities are not very meaningful. They really, in any given theater of war, they don't really have anything that amounts even closely to what we will call air superiority. On the political level, I'm just going to mention the financial constraints that were also mentioned before already. And of course, the Iranian proxy strategy has created some considerable pushback in the region, including here, where it has led to some kind of alignment between Israel and some of the Gulf states on a level that we haven't seen before, I would argue. As you can see, there's also a question below. Maybe we can also, talk about this in the discussion. I'm really not sure about the answer myself, so I'll just put it there. Whoops. No, there's one slide missing. I took a slide out. Yeah, well, anyway, it doesn't matter. So there's one slide missing now, but I'm just going to go over it without a slide. Just want to talk briefly about the factors that can negatively affect the Iranian strategy. And now remember, I'm of course not advocating that any of these hurdles should be used against Iran's proxy strategy. I'm Swiss after all. I'm neutral. I'm merely pointing out. No, I'm not kidding. Please, don't tell my boss. No, I merely want to point out that, some of the factors that I'm going to mention right now already have a negative impact on Iran's proxy strategy, or could have so potentially. So we heard about the economic pressure before. I'm going to leave that aside. We have talked about diverging preferences and disagreements, but let me just give you one quick example. In May 2006, Mustafa Badr ad-Din is Hezbollah's military commander, and he's the successor of the very infamous Imad Muniyah, died near Damascus airport. And at first, Iran claimed that he had been killed by a single rebel artillery strike. This would have been the most precise artillery strike, I think, in the history of warfare. So, well done, rebels. No, but of course that was nonsense. There were also some rumors that it was the Israelis, but I think there's really good reason to believe that Mustafa Badr ad-Din was actually killed by his own bodyguard, and at the behest of both Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Quds Force, and Hassan Nasrallah. So, as in every setting involving humans, there is disagreement, there are rivalries, and if you're one of Iran's adversaries, you're going to have options to exploit and amplify some of these disagreements, and they can end deadly for some of the people in the field. Another challenge, I think, that it can be posed for the Iranian proxy strategy is the support and strengthening of partner forces, such as the Iraqi Counter-Terrorism Service or Kurdish forces in Iraq and Syria. But I also got to say that, just strengthening partner forces of Iran's adversaries it's very context dependent. It might work in one place, but it might not work in another. So some people also suggest that you should really, even pour in more military aid to the Lebanese army, and this would help against Hezbollah in Lebanon. And I don't really agree with that. I don't think that this will pose a serious challenge to the Iranians. And finally, the last point that would have been on my slide is the issue of denial operations. And I don't know if you have paid attention over the last couple of weeks, but I heard about a couple of denial operations that happened in Syria. They mostly involved kinetic strikes by an air force that we don't really know where they're coming from. And they targeted weapons caches, they targeted proxy forces, and they targeted all kinds of, I'm sure this Air Force was origins I really don't know about. They have a very nice target list. Let's just put it that way. But I also think that denial operations will also increasingly feature non-lethal components such as cyber, information, or influence operations. And with that, I'm finished and going to sit down. Thank you very much.